Hello and welcome back to another Rush Duel Links deck profile. Today we're finally taking a look at everyone's favourite vanilla boss, Princess of the Flock Miss Mutton. In Japanese, this card was called meeeg-chan and was a bit of a fan favourite, mostly because of its appearance in the anime, in which the character named Tomatosaurs was basically obsessed with Miss Mutton, had a bunch of merch, could dress up as it, and then eventually the card did come to life and become a real duelist in the show and has been referenced several times because of this. So this card has been featured quite prominently in the anime, but it is just a 2500 attack, 1600 level 7 beast normal monster, which doesn't really do a ton, right? But it is perfect to be combined with Secret Order, which will let us special summon it, give it attack boost, etc, etc. So let's talk about the skill first. We're using Servant of Dawn. Why Servant of Dawn? Well, we want a skill basically that just buffs Miss Mutton, and we'll get into that a little bit more in depth as we kind of go through the card by card, but in general, just giving your Miss Mutton an extra boost is pretty good. But this skill can only be used if your deck contains 5 or more normal monsters with 1500 or more defense, and all of the level 4 or higher monsters have 1200 or more defense. Requirement: you have a face-up level 6 or higher normal monster with 1500 defense or higher. Effect: one face-up normal monster on your field gains 600 attack. So, worst case scenario, we just summon out Miss Mutton, we give it an extra 600 attack. Okay, that's fine. Now, we do have a brand new monster in Woolly Wonderland Ground Mutton, which is a normal monster with 1500 defense, which does work for our skill, which means we don't actually have to play that many high level monsters in the deck, but we are still playing 5. And the reason for that is we need Miss Mutton for the deck to work. We wanted an extra level 7 normal in Galactica Oblivion, just so that Secret Order is kind of always going to be live. And Ancient Gear Golem is just such a good card that we wouldn't not include it. So I guess we'll start there. Ancient Gear Golem. 3000 attack, 3000 defense, level 8 monster. Cannot be special summoned, and this card inflicts piercing battle damage. That is already an amazing effect. But on top of that, your opponent can't activate trap cards when it declares an attack. This is obviously fantastic against any of the traps in the game. Obviously Legend, Slime, and things like card restoration. Ancient Gear Golem, any deck where you can fit this in, you probably should. A lot of decks will basically have a skill which say you can't play it. If your deck doesn't have a restrictive skill like that, you should be playing this card. It is just that good. Then we'll talk about Woolly Wonderland Planyu. So this is a pretty interesting card. 1100 attack is not bad, 200 defense is a little bit low. But if we have a face-up beast-type normal monster on our field, so for this deck, that's going to be specifically Gazelle, that's going to be the Ground Mutton, and that's going to be Miss Mutton herself. We can set one Meat and Greed or Woolly Wonderland Graveyard Grudge from our graveyard to our spell and trap card zone. If we have Princess of the Flock Miss Mutton face up on your field, we can also gain 600 life points. Now, 600 life points is nice, it's an okay amount. Sometimes it might even save your life, but that's not the main reason we're playing this. We're using this basically to get back Meat and Greed. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but basically it acts as a free +1, and the spell card is pretty good as well. Now, the trap card, Graveyard Grudge, this card's not so good, so we're not playing this card, and it is a limit 1 card as well, which does also make it a little bit restricted. Doesn't really matter for this deck, but it's good to know. But it's when an opponent's monster declares an attack targeting your attack position beast-type normal monster, send the top 4 cards of your deck to the graveyard. The attacked monster, so our monster, would then lose 2000 attack until the end of this turn. Then we can add up to 4 cards sent to the graveyard to meet the requirement to our hand. So basically, we can draw 4 cards in exchange for almost guaranteeing we lose combat. And unfortunately, this downside is just way, way too big. Drawing 4 cards is actually quite nice, especially if we can end with quite a large hand already, but it's just not worth it realistically. A lot of the time when we activate it, it will just kill us. Then we're playing the 2 Imaginary Reactor. An Imaginary Reactor is actually pretty good in this deck because we want to see our normal monsters in the graveyard because we'll get maximum value off of Secret Order from special summoning from the graveyard, so milling is generally quite good. As well as the fact that if we do happen to get a monster inclination in the graveyard, we can draw 2 cards. So that's basically all this is for. We want to summon it, use its effect, ideally draw those 2 cards, and then tribute it off to get out one of our boss monsters, that being our Princess of the Flock Miss Mutton, that being Galactica Oblivion, or that being Ancient Gear Golem. Then we have 2 copies of Paku Paku Chu. This card, again, really, really good. We can use this in 2 different ways. We can either just get back a body to be tributed, so either our Gazelle or our Ground Mutton, or we can get back a boss in Miss Mutton, which is really, really good. That basically allows Paku Paku Chu to now be multifaceted. It doesn't just get you an extra body, now it can get back a boss as well, which is really, really good. Then we have Galactica Oblivion. We've already spoken about this card a little bit, but it's also got that nice 2500 defense. So setting this on turn 1 is not a bad play. Now, there are some things that will counter this like Harvey, but in general, setting a 2500 defense monster on turn 1 is pretty good. And then there's Miss Mutton herself. She's the heart and soul of the deck, so we have to play 3. And then we have Gazelle. Now, Gazelle is quite an interesting card because it does have that 1200 defense, which does make it pretty good against things like Light Galaxy that do like to pierce over your monsters. So having a good attack and defense stat is pretty good. As well as the fact that we can use Servant of Dawn with our Gazelle, because all we have to do is have a face-up level 6 or higher normal monster with 1500 or higher defense. So that means we could have a Miss Mutton, or we could have a Ground Mutton, and then we can still put the boost onto Gazelle. Because all we have to do is target a face-up normal monster on the field and it gains 600. So sometimes boosting Gazelle up by 600 up to 21 can be very relevant. Then we have Willy Wonderland Ground Mutton, 1500 defense, really good against a lot of decks, unfortunately really bad against exactly Light Galaxy because they can change this into attack mode using Meteor Charge and attack over it. Other than that, it's pretty much a fantastic card. And then we have Secret Order, again the heart and soul of the deck. This is probably, I would argue, the third best Secret Order deck behind Light Galaxy and behind Blaster's Inferno. I think Miss Mutton is basically the third best deck for this. It's still a really good card. We can boost by 700. So primarily we're going to want to bring back Miss Mutton, boosted by 700 up to 32. Then we can use Servant of Dawn to get it up to 38, which is a pretty good number. Now, that unfortunately still won't get over 4,000, which means a Cyber End or an Yggdrago could still be kind of out of reach, but it's pretty good nonetheless, and we do have a way to deal with those, which we'll get to in a minute. Then we have Monster Incarnation. This is in here primarily to basically be used as Pot of Greed in combination with Imaginary Reactor, but getting back other cards to our hand can be quite good. If we get back Paku Pakuchu, this represents an extra +1. We can get back Ancient Gear Golem to our hand and resummon it out, which can be really, really good, and getting back Miss Mutton itself is also really, really strong. Then we have Rage of the Beasts. It's not the best back row hate card because it does require us to have 2 or more face-up beast or beast warrior type monsters, but back row hate is still back row hate, so we will be playing this. And then we get to Meet and Greed. So this card is basically the win condition of the deck. We can send 2 cards from our hand to the graveyard, then choose 1 face-up beast type normal monster on our field. So notably, this doesn't have a level requirement, so we can actually choose Gazelle if we're in a bit of a dire situation. But this turn, that monster can make up to 3 attacks on monsters. If you have Princess of the Flock Miss Mutton face up on the field, you can also make all face up effect monsters on your opponent's field lose 500 attack to the end of this turn. So we already spoke about how we can get Miss Mutton up to 38. So now with Meet and Greed, we can get basically the extra 500, so it can attack over even 4,000 attack monsters, which is pretty good. But the general combo is going to be summon out your Miss Mutton on 38, reduce the attack of all your opponent's face up monsters, ideally 3, by 500 each, attack over each of them with Miss Mutton, and OTK your opponent. And if this works out, we win the game. If it doesn't, we might be in a bit of a sticky situation. But this is basically the key combo of the deck. We do want to play this like an aggressive OTK deck, and that is how we'll be winning the majority of our games with this deck. Then we have Widespread Ruin. We are on Widespread because we do already have 2 Limit 2 cards in Meet and Greed, which means we cannot play Negate Attack. And then we're on card Restoration, and this is in here for a couple of reasons. First off, gaining life points can be relevant. This card does also work against any monster's attacks, so even those fusion decks, we can potentially survive a hit with this card, as well as just drawing up to 5 cards and then drawing an extra card on the turn, going up to 6. Having the extra card can be relevant in making these big plays, especially when you have card effects like Meet and Greed that do require you to send a lot of cards to the graveyard. We want to make sure we've got enough to be able to do everything we want to do, so that is the logic behind card Restoration. The extra deck in here is completely superfluous, it does not matter at all, so we just chucked whatever we have in here, including a nice Chronicle Rare, which we can start grinding on the ladder. So let's get into some of the nitty gritty. This deck is reasonably fun. It's also reasonably simple to play. Basically, any deck that's a order deck is going to be pretty unga bunga. We're basically relying on normal monsters to get most of the job done. Unfortunately, order decks do have this problem where they sort of don't have a great grind game. So if we use all of our secret orders, we've kind of used everything interesting we've got. Now, we still can pull off an OTK with Meet and Greed if your opponent isn't prepared for it, or if they misplay into it, or if they overextend, we can punish that. But outside of exactly that, we kind of want to kill our opponent relatively quickly because, like we say, the grind game, not so good. But this deck is able to very competently rush down your opponent by just swarming the board with big guys in a very similar way to Light Galaxy, except Light Galaxy has really good ways to deal with set 3 pass, where this deck really doesn't. Unfortunately, if your opponent does go on the defensive, we have to rely on Ancient Gear Golem to really do anything through that. We can use Meet and Greed to clear, but then our biggest guy isn't going to be attacking directly, so we'd have to rely on the other 2 monsters to get those direct attacks in and hope that's enough damage to really get something in, which is also the sort of time you might want to use Gazelle with the Meet and Greed, so Gazelle clears all of them, and then we can use Miss Mutton to attack directly. So that is one of the little tricks this deck can do. So this deck is not realistically super competitive, but it can definitely win games. This deck can steal games, especially if your opponent isn't prepared for it, and especially if your opponent overextends. This deck basically really likes to punish your opponent for overextending. But let's fire in some replays so I can show you what I've been talking about.